Okay, so this chapter is going to be about the regulation of temperature and body fluids, and a lot of what we're going to see here is going to involve the urinary system. So let's take a look at the major functions of the urinary system. First of all, excretion of nitrogen waste. This is a normal byproduct of protein metabolism, so everybody is going to manufacture nitrogen waste. Secondly, maintenance of the water-salt balance. So one sort of overriding theme to remember is that water tends to follow salt. Um, it'll follow salt in open areas, and it'll also follow salt across membranes, and that would be something that would be called osmosis. The third thing is the maintenance of the acid-base balance. So how acidic or how alkaline that your bloodstream is a really important thing because pH can affect both the structure and the function of proteins. So you've got a lot of proteins that carry out crucial functions in and around your bloodstream, and it's important to keep your blood at the proper pH. And so how would the urinary system be involved with that? Basically, the urinary system has the ability to get rid of hydrogen ions, and that would get rid basically of acidity. And the fourth is secretion of hormones. The kidneys actually are responsible for secreting hormones that have effects on blood volume and blood pressure around the body. Okay, so when we talk about homeostasis, um, a lot of the time a thermostat is given as an example of homeostasis. So a thermostat will basically keep the temperature in a room within a certain range. So you set the thermostat and you won't go too much above or too much below that particular temperature. And likewise with the human body, there are a lot of characteristics that need to stay within a certain range. And I'm sure you already know this because you've heard of things like people having low or high blood sugar, low or high blood sodium, low or high blood pressure, low or high body temperature. And so all of these things are called homeostatic variables because they have to exist within a fairly narrow range. And so animal bodies will regulate temperature, nutrients, and body fluid composition. So basically, um, how warm are you? How much do you have of each nutrient in the bloodstream? And basically, how watery is your blood? So there are a lot of different ways to maintain homeostasis. So penguins and parrots and roadrunners, these are three different birds that have different access to fresh water. So although penguins live in the ocean, they don't have a lot of access to fresh water. Most of the fresh water that they're around is frozen. And so they've got to be very careful about maintaining the amount of water in their bloodstream. Um, Roadrunners don't have access to much water at all. So they've got to be very careful in how they excrete and how they lose water through breathing. So those are regulated in different ways. Parrots are in a tropical rainforest, and so they've got a lot of access to fresh water, and so they're not particularly careful in terms of regulating the water content of their bodies because there's always more out there. Okay, so if we move to body temperature regulation, thermoregulation is the control of body temperature, and the main source of heat for an animal may be external or internal, and so we're going to see a couple of different terms here. First of all, an endotherm can maintain a constant body temperature because there's heat generated during metabolism, and this balances out any heat that's lost to the environment. The word itself actually tells you what's going on. So therm meaning temperature, endo meaning within. So basically internal temperature. So temperature is regulated internally. So in endotherms, and including us, the hypothalamus will detect body temperatures, and this will start up responses that will either warm or cool the body. So let's say that your temperature is too high. Your hypothalamus will detect that it's too high because it gets signals from thermoreceptors in the skin and in other organs that detect temperature. And so basically, at that point, you need to lose heat. So you'll do a number of things. You'll sweat. Blood vessels will dilate. This is why you turn red when you get hot. And also voluntary changes in behavior. So move to shade, get off the treadmill, grab some ice water. So there are a lot of different things that you can do to cool down body temperature. So let's say that your body temperature is too low. Same sort of receptors are going to detect this. Thermoreceptors in the skin, other organs, and in the hypothalamus. And so what's going to happen here, shivering for one. Secondly, the blood vessels will constrict in a lot of peripheral areas. And so depending on how cold you are, basically what your body's going to do is it's going to act to keep your core warm. So your central nervous system and your thoracic and abdominal organs, and it'll actually start shutting down blood supply to more peripheral parts of the body. So fingers, toes, nose, unfortunately genitals. So basically your body will act to preserve the core. And so one of the reasons why people can lose body parts in frostbite is because those body parts will have gone without blood for so long that the cells in those body parts die. And so that's how extreme frostbite can actually cause you to lose parts. Okay, now in ectotherm, this literally means outside of the body. So therm meaning temperature and ecto meaning outside. So an ectotherm gains its temperature from outside the body. And so while endotherms were mammals and fishes, ectotherms are all invertebrates, fishes, amphibians, and non-avian reptiles. So most animals by far are actually ectotherms. And so again, your body temperature is going to vary with external conditions. And how do they maintain their body temperature? Well, basically they move to where it's warm. So you'll see insects, snakes, reptiles, turtles. They'll basically get out and sun themselves if their body temperature isn't high enough. Or if their body temperature is too high, they'll move to shaded areas. And because they don't use all of that energy in terms of metabolism to maintain their body temperature, they require a whole lot less food than endotherms do. And so this is why snakes can eat like once every few days. Okay, so there are other adaptations that help maintain body temperature homeostasis. And so in this wolf, it's got an adaptation to cold called counter-current exchange. And in counter-current exchange, you'll notice that the blood flow through the artery on the left and the blood flow through the vein on the right is going in opposite directions. And so basically, as the vessels carry this really warm blood towards the extremities, they'll actually give heat to vessels that are carrying cold blood back towards the body. So this is another way in which extremities kind of get robbed of temperature because since this colder blood is coming back towards the core and you don't want to give your core that kind of shock, then basically the arteries will, no pun intended, bleed heat over to the veins. And this is a major reason why arteries and veins often run in parallel tracks for this countercurrent exchange. Okay, so there are, of course, behavioral adaptations, and these mammals are showing behavioral adaptations to adjust their body temperature. And on the left, you see huddling, which conserves heat, and then on the right, you see the dog panting, and that loses excess heat. And so these are behavioral adaptations. And so I have to be honest with you, I do kind of prefer huddling to panting myself. Okay, so there's another characteristic that is a homeostatic characteristic, or what's called a homeostatic variable, and that is water and salts. And so basically, urine helps regulate salt balance in the body, and this is something that's called osmoregulation. So if you'll recall a few slides ago, I said that water tends to follow salt across membranes, and this is something that's called osmoregulation. And so basically, osmoregulation is the idea that you monitor and adjust the amount of solutes or the amount of salts that are in the bloodstream. And so marine fish and freshwater fish have got very different adaptations for maintaining the water and salt balance. So if you look at the saltwater fish on the right, this is your first key here, that water is going to leave by osmosis. And so because the seawater outside the fish is so much saltier than the environment inside the fish, water is going to tend to want to move towards that saltier water outside. And so basically, what are things that the fish needs to do in order to keep its water content in its cells steady? Well, first of all, you're going to actively transport salts out of the gills. And so what this means is that the gills literally pump salt from the fish's bloodstream out of the bloodstream because the fish has been drinking seawater this entire time. And so does the fish keep the salt? No, it doesn't. It actually actively transports the salt out through the gills. The other thing is that there's little to no water that leaves in the urine. So a seawater fish will actually put out extremely concentrated urine. Okay. Now freshwater fish have a different problem. They're in water that has a whole lot less salt than in their bloodstream. And so with freshwater, water tends to enter by osmosis, and if it does that, it has the possibility of actually bursting cells. And so what are the fish going to do? Well, first of all, they're not going to drink fresh water at all. But secondly, their gills are actually going to actively transport salts into the gills to try to get salt in there. And the third thing is that they're going to excrete a lot of water. So basically, freshwater fish are going to urinate a whole lot more than saltwater fish are. So one thing to sort of note here is that both of these types of fish they're pretty well adapted to their environments. So most of the time, if you take a saltwater fish and put it into freshwater, or if you take a freshwater fish and put it into saltwater, they're going to be in a lot of distress almost immediately. So the saltwater fish are going to retain too much water. They're going to have cells starting to burst all over the body because they don't have any defenses against fresh water. And if you put freshwater fish into saltwater, they're going to get dehydrated extremely quickly because they're spending time urinating a lot of water. And so since their mechanism is to lose water, they're going to get dehydrated really quickly. Okay, so there are other strategies that obtain and conserve water on land. So if you look at us on the right, humans, how do we get our water? 39% by liquids, believe it or not, 47% by solid food. And our cellular respiration actually generates some water. So what's our water loss? 59% through the urine, 37% through the skin and lungs. So even if you were in a situation where you were really dehydrated and your body stopped urinating, you're still going to lose water through the skin and particularly through exhaling. Now, if you look at the kangaroo rat on the left, so it gains about 10% of its water through solid food, but what it does is to really hang on to the water that its metabolism, that cellular respiration actually generates. And so how do they lose the water? 22% through the urine. And that may seem like a high percentage, but they actually don't urinate very much at all. And because they don't urinate very much at all, actually most of their water loss is through the skin and lungs. And of that 73%, I would say that the vast majority of that 73% is basically through breathing. And so how else can kangaroo rats regulate the amount of water that they lose? They spend a lot more time going out during night than they do during day. And in the cooler temperature, you're less likely to actually lose moisture from the lungs. Okay, so the digestive system breaks food down into particles that cells can absorb. We've seen that. But what happens to the waste that the cells produces? Well, one of the problems that you can get with eating a lot of protein is that the cell will actually produce what are called nitrogenous wastes. And so enzymes break proteins into amino acids, and as those amino acids are processed by the cells, then it can strip off. If you look at the very top diagram, it can actually strip off what's called an NH3 group. And NH3 is basically ammonia. Now, fish get rid of ammonia just by excreting it directly out into the water through the gills. So just bang, straight out right there. But other animals actually have to do things a different way. And so if you look at the left, you can see that ammonia gets converted into urea, which is a lot less toxic, and this gets excreted in the urine of mammals. If you look at the right, you'll see where those NH and NH groups are going. into uric acid, which gets excreted in the urine of birds and insects. And uric acid is actually a lot more concentrated um, in the urine of birds than urea is in like mammal urine. And this is the reason why bird droppings are only semi-liquid. Okay, so again, uh, there's the NH3 group, or sorry, the NH2 group, and again, in mammals, urea is excreted in urine, and in birds and insects as uric acid. And so, why would you see this much more concentration in birds and insects? The main reason is because they fly. And so you can't basically carry around this big tank of urine, which is basically what the urinary bladder is. And because birds and insects have to conserve weight for flight, then they're not going to have a urinary bladder. They're not going to dissolve urea in a bunch of water. They're going to excrete it as, like I said, sort of a semi-liquid. Okay, so again, the way that fish remove nitrogenous wastes is they just excrete it, the ammonia, straight out into the water, and it diffuses away so it doesn't present a difficulty for them. All right, so how does our body transport metabolic wastes, water, and salt from the bloodstream to urine? And this is what we're going to spend basically the rest of this PowerPoint on, is the urinary. So basically, this filters blood, it eliminates nitrogenous waste, it helps maintain the ion concentration of body fluids. And what I mean by ion concentration is basically things like hydrogen, sodium, potassium, calcium, and so forth. Now, if you look at the diagram to the right, let's just take a look at all these different organs. So one is the adrenal glands, and I know that it's easy to associate adrenal glands just with adrenaline, but the adrenal glands are made up of basically two major layers. One is the adrenal cortex, and one is the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is what produces epinephrine, what we call adrenaline a lot of the time. But the adrenal glands do more than just that. What they do is they'll produce what are called, and you don't have to know this, mineralocorticoids, which are hormones that actually help the body maintain its balance of things like sodium and potassium. So one other thing that I want to sort of tell you about, and I talk about this a lot because it's something I only realized a few years ago. Felt kind of dumb for not noticing it all this time. So if you look at the word adrenal, it you can divide it up into adrenal, and that literally means on top of the kidneys. And so they're named after their location, the adrenal glands, the adrenal glands. Okay, speaking of the kidneys, this says they maintain homeostasis in blood composition. So basically, a lot of different components of the blood plasma are either kept, or either retained, or they're gotten rid of in the kidneys. So the ureters, that's two down, they actually transport urine to the bladder. We'll talk about the mechanism of that in a little bit. And the urinary bladder will actually store urine before elimination. Um, and the urethra is the tube that runs from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. So the tissue types of the urinary system, the epithelial tissue is that sort of thin tissue that allows diffusion of substances between the fluid in the kidneys and in the bloodstream. And so this is going to, this is what the functional parts of the kidney are made of, and it's also going to line the ureters and the bladder. In terms of connective tissue that's present in the kidneys, blood is a connective tissue, but there's also a fairly tough connective tissue capsule that's around the kidneys. With muscle tissue is involved in the urinary system because smooth muscle will actually squeeze on the ureter tubes and control it'll control the flow of urine from the kidneys to the bladder. And there's also a lot of smooth muscle in the walls of the bladder, which will control urine release. And there are also sphincters that control release of urine from the bladder into the urethra. As far as nervous tissue goes, there are cells in the hypothalamus that coordinate with the kidneys to maintain salt concentration in body fluids. And there are also it doesn't mention this here, but there are also what are called stretch receptors in the urinary bladder that allow the brain to detect when the urinary bladder has been stretched out too much by urine. Okay, so again, these are the major organs of the urinary system. The kidneys, they basically make urine. The ureters, they carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder. This is done by a process called peristalsis, which is basically a squeezing of the smooth muscle in those tubes. So one thing that I want to remind you is you don't have to be standing, you don't have to be upright to get urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder. And so you don't have to be vertical for this to happen. You can be horizontal. Everyone who wakes up in the morning knows what's happened during the night. And so basically, it's this peristalsis that moves urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The urinary bladder holds urine. It contains two sphincter muscles that release the urine. One of these is involuntary and the other one is voluntary. And it's a good thing that one of those is voluntary because that allows us some control over the release of urine. And finally, the urethra is the tube that actually carries urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. Okay, so the kidneys, again, are the major organs of the urinary system. As the kidneys form urine from blood plasma, it'll basically try to reabsorb nutrients. We'll get into a little bit more detail about that in a minute. And it'll expel wastes into the urine. And this is going to travel through the ureters to the urinary bladder, and then from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body through the urethra. So in terms of capacity, the wall of the bladder can stretch to hold about 250 mils of urine, a little bit more in men, a little bit less in women. And this is the only reason why is because on average men are a little bit larger than women, so the bladder size is a little bit bigger. And again, remember these are average numbers. This varies from person to person. And so there are sphincter muscles which will cause the bladder to contract. So when those muscles actually relax, those sphincter muscles that are normally blocking the passage of urine out of the urinary bladder, they'll send a signal up the spinal cord, and then the bladder itself will actually squeeze because there's smooth muscle that's in the walls of the bladder. So this will release the stored urine. And the final bullet point says that things that can impact this are pregnancy and prostate issues, and two very different things happen here. So in pregnancy, during late stage pregnancy, the uterus and the fetus are occupying just a ton of the abdominal pelvic cavity, so most of the storage space, and it's going to squeeze everything else, including the urinary bladder. And so because the urinary bladder is blocked from expanding as much as it can, what it does is really reduce the capacity of the urinary bladder, and pregnant women have to pee a whole lot more. The prostate is a gland that contributes contents to semen. And so it actually surrounds the urethra on its way from the urinary bladder to the outside. So remember that in men, the urethra isn't a passage only for urine, it's a passage for both urine and semen. And so both the reproductive system and the urinary system can empty contents into the urethra. And so basically the prostate is downstream of the bladder, and if the prostate enlarges, then it can actually constrict the urethra, and in that case a man will have a lot more difficulty urinating. And so this is kind of the opposite problem. Instead of emptying too often, it doesn't empty often enough, and sometimes a shunt has to be placed or surgery has to be done to correct this problem. Okay, so how is it that the kidneys actually filter blood? So I want to talk about three different regions here. One is the renal cortex, which is the outermost layer of the kidney. And this is actually where most of the filtration of blood happens. And so your next question probably is, well, what is filtration of blood? If you think about a coffee filter, think about this. You place the grains in the coffee filter, and then water runs through it. And so most of the contents of the coffee actually remain in the filter, but the coffee itself, the fluid, it goes through the filter. And so as blood goes through the kidneys, we'll see a structure called the glomerulus, in which the blood in those blood vessels actually gets forced through the walls of the capillaries by the pressure of the heart. And when this happens, blood plasma and some of the contents of the blood plasma will actually leave the bloodstream and go into the tubules of the kidneys. The majority of this happens in the renal cortex. The renal medulla is basically a place for reclaiming water. Okay, so this happens a while after the initial filtrate goes through, and so there is what's called a concentration gradient, where the contents of the renal medulla get saltier and saltier and saltier as you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so remember that water follows salt. So as the urine travels deeper and deeper and deeper into the renal medulla, the medulla can actually draw a lot of the water back out of the urine and into the capillaries that surround these tubules. So this is where a lot of reabsorption of water actually takes place, is in the renal medulla. The renal pelvis is the area where the filtrate is collected. And at this point, once it enters the renal pelvis, all the processing of the urine is done. So the amount of ions, if there's anything that's going to be excreted by the body into the urine, things like excess hormones, drugs if you're taking any, and I'm not talking about the illegal kind necessarily. Prescription drugs, antibiotics get released in the urinary system. And so at this point in the renal pelvis, the body's through processing it, so it gets called urine at this point. Okay, so how is it that they actually carry out this filtration? We're going to go into that in more detail by examining a structure called the nephron. And if you look at the three diagrams below, you've got the kidney, and they've pulled out kind of a little pie piece of it, where the cortex is on the upper portion and the medulla is on the lower portion. So those structures that are called nephrons, there are several million nephrons in each kidney. And if you look to the right, you'll see the nephron. And it starts with that structure called the glomerulus, and it ends with a structure called the distal convoluted tubule. Don't worry, we'll track our way through the nephron in just a little bit. Okay, so first off, blood gets filtered into a nephron at a glomerular capsule, which is right there at the arrow. So each of these capsules contains a bed of capillaries that's called a glomerulus, which is right here. Now the walls of these capillaries and a couple of underlying protein layers, these make a three-part filter. And so when pressure from the heart pushes blood plasma or pushes blood through the glomerulus, the blood plasma and some of its contents get pushed out into the capsule. So it's no longer blood plasma, it's known as filtrate. And so basically you see the manufacture of filtrate from blood plasma. So what is it that actually leaves the glomerulus? Well, what actually leaves the glomerulus is a lot of things that are dissolved into the bloodstream, like ions, glucose. Things that generally don't leave are cells don't leave, and proteins don't leave, because proteins are too large to get through the filter. They're basically like the coffee grounds that are left behind in the coffee filter. Okay, so the renal tubule is surrounded by peritubular capillaries. And so what's happening here with the peritubular capillaries is sometimes they'll reclaim a lot of what's in the filtrate. And so you may have heard the phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That basically means don't throw out the bad or the good with the bad. And so in this case, that's exactly what has happened at the glomerulus. Not only wastes, but a lot of nutrients and a lot of things that the body needs have actually been pushed out of the blood plasma. And so the job of the peritubular capillaries is to reabsorb as many nutrients as possible and as little waste as possible on their route through. And so here are the peritubular capillaries. You can see that they're around the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and around the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so the filtrate actually goes through the tubules in this particular order. First through the proximal convoluted tubule, then the descending nephron loop, then the ascending nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule. So along the way, some substances like glucose get reabsorbed into the bloodstream. And in fact, our mechanism for reabsorbing glucose is so efficient that you shouldn't see any of it showing up in urine. So basically, along the route through the tubules, all glucose should get reabsorbed. And the only time that somebody's going to have glucose show up in the urine is if they're diabetic, or maybe a kid the day after Halloween after they've had like 3 pounds of candy and they've completely overloaded the system. But under normal circumstances, you should not see glucose in the bloodstream. You shouldn't see proteins in the bloodstream because they're normally too big to get through the filter. And if you see proteins showing up in the bloodstream, this may be an indication of physical damage to the kidney. Same thing, of course, goes for any sort of cells. So if you see any kind of blood in the urine, it means you've had a pretty substantial amount of damage to the kidney. So let's go ahead and take a look at the route of urine or of filtrate through the nephron. And if you look at the glomerulus, you'll see a yellow dot appear, and we'll get started with this. All right, you tell me you could have resisted that idea once you'd had it. So you saw the route through the through the tubules, and basically a collecting duct is going to receive filtrate from several different nephrons. Now, if your body needs to reclaim a lot of water, then collecting ducts are where it's going to happen, and we'll go through the mechanism of that in the next video.